All right. I would like to wish everybody here a very warm welcome. Like I said before, my name is Alex, and I have the distinct pleasure and delight to introduce our speakers today. The title of the talk is Beyond Oneness, a True Spirit Approach to Social Construction, Social Justice, and Psychedelics. I'm joined by Marca Cassity and Katherine Costello. I will read a short introduction for each of the speakers, and they'll come on into the video room to share their talk. They'll speak for approximately 25 minutes, give or take, and then we'll have time for questions and answers and a discussion afterward. If you do have questions, you can put them in the Q&A on the right, and I'll be taking a look at those questions throughout today's talk, and we'll bring those up and ask them on your behalf at the end. Without further ado, let's get started. I'll begin by introducing Marca Cassity. They have over 20 years of experience in the healing arts, and they've worked with renowned therapists, spiritual teachers, artists, academics, and medicine people from around the world. After completing a BSN at the University of Oklahoma and working as an ER nurse for several years, their journey as a therapist began by overcoming their own trauma and cultivating resilience as a two-spirit, queer, mixed-race Native American who grew up on the Osage Reservation of Oklahoma. Their clinical training was at the Native American Health Center in San Francisco, with additional training at the Indian Country Child Trauma Center at the University of Oklahoma, studying under Dr. Dolores Bigfoot. A critically acclaimed songwriter, Marca delivers inspired folk rock spirit songs with Native nuances. I've heard these songs, they're really inspiring. They speak to overcoming hardship through resilience and connection to nature, humor, love, compassion, spirituality, and heritage. Marca has spent time on the advisory board for diversity with MAPS, works as a therapist in private practice in Portland, and more recently has joined a research team at OHSU working with psychedelics for transforming trauma in gender diverse communities. I'd like to welcome Marca. And our co-speaker today is Dr. Katherine A. Costello, a transformational coach specializing in gender, sexuality, and psychedelic integration, an excellent combination. She holds a PhD in feminist and queer theory from Duke University, has published, taught, and presented at numerous conferences on the intersections of feminist, queer, and trans theories and social movements. Since leaving the academy, Dr. Costello's research has been focused on how to live a feminist, queer, and/or trans life. A Buddhist practitioner, she is especially interested in the role of mindfulness and psychedelics in the internal and interpersonal work of living a liberated life for the benefit of all beings. She is also the North America Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Manager for a global environmental consulting company. So I would like to welcome both of our speakers to give their talk. Please welcome with your hearts and with silent applause, Marca Cassity and Katherine A. Costello.
Oh, there we are. Here we are. There you are.
Hello.
Hello. I'm Marca Cassity.
I'm Katherine Costello.
And so basically, Kate and I spend a lot of time talking about identity and trauma and psychedelics and diversity and stuff like that, right? And from that, we were asked by Shakruna to co-author an article. Well, we ended up co-authoring it. I don't know how that came about, but and that article is why oneness is not incompatible with identity politics, and we might try to get that in the chat so people can take a look at that article. But from there, Shakruna asked that we would maybe speak today, so we thought we would just kind of bring this article forth a little more and bring it to life. I am a trauma therapist and a nurse and have a clinical practice, but I'm also an artist and a storyteller, and I've lived as a traveling musician and a spiritual seeker, and so from a clinician, I really pull from a lived experience, I suppose. And Kate is an academic and a writer, and a diversity, equity, and inclusion manager, and a transformational coach, and a dancer. So we kind of have differing backgrounds, but we co-authored it. It's cool. People are liking it. So we thought, okay, let's just do some more of that today from these backgrounds and see what we get. So we hope you enjoy. And as Alex mentioned, thank you, Alex, for that wonderful introduction, and for Chacruna for having us. And we'll have some Q&A later on.
Great. Thanks, Marca, for giving the context in which kind of our collaboration has emerged and the kinds of conversations that we're ongoingly having that have led to the conversation that we're sharing with you today. Thanks also, as Marca just said, thanks to Alex for that great introduction, and for Chacruna for holding this, making space for these kinds of conversations. And thank you to all of you in the audience. We can't see you, but we know you're there. We're glad you're there. Thank you for joining us today. So, in the last few years, we've seen a growing attention to how the psychedelic renaissance can better address the needs of marginalized communities and make sure that those communities can access psychedelic therapies or psychedelic assisted therapies as they become more widely available. At the same time as we're seeing that, we're seeing resistance and opposition emerge from a fairly small but incredibly vocal part of the community. That is saying the main argument that is kind of recurring is that identity politics, so a drive to focus and organize around identity markers like race, gender, sexual orientation, etc., is incompatible with the medicine's teaching of oneness. And that's it was that noticing of those conversations happening that really sort of started the article, this conversation, and Marca and my sort of deepening reflection on the entanglement of these questions. So I'm going to just offer a somewhat brief overview of the potential harm in holding oneness as the ultimate psychedelic experience. It's probably harmful for all marginalized communities, but it's especially so, and we will be focusing on the harm for LGBTQIA2S+ communities, because those are the communities that we're a part of and work in. And then Marca is going to offer a little bit about their personal journey of healing, psychedelic healing, and how plant spirit medicines have helped them come forth in their queerness and their two-spirit identities. And then at the end, I'll go over a little bit this piece around how oneness isn't incompatible with identity politics. And then we just have some suggestions, some questions that we want to share with you as just offerings of thoughts, things we might think about collectively to deepen our understanding of the intersections between psychedelic healing and queer and trans identities. And just to be clear before we really get into things, we absolutely acknowledge that some people, including queer and trans people, have experiences of oneness through psychedelics, and that those are powerful, transformative, and healing, and we absolutely celebrate that.
Yes, we're not anti. We're not anti. And yeah, that Dr. Bronner soap that has all one on it. Like, I love washing my hands with the all one soap. Just think on the other side, it might say all different, all one, all different. That's just a suggestion, but yeah, we're not anti.
Right. So totally pro those experiences of oneness, right? But what we're hoping to do today is help legitimize other kinds of experiences, encourage more research on the intersection between the LGBTQIA2S+ communities and the potential of psychedelics for healing or transcendence, and then debunk these claims that somehow focusing on identity politics means that we've missed the teaching about oneness. And just a note on terminology, I'm mostly going to just be referring to queer and trans communities. It rolls off the tongue a little more easily, but it really mean yes, mean broadly, the broadest understanding of that community. So the belief that the ultimate psychedelic experience, that the truth that psychedelic experiences have to teach us is oneness, that's the dominant narrative, both in community spaces and in clinical spaces. It's probably very familiar to most, if not all of you attending have heard some version of this, right? But this is just extremely common. And just for one example, is within the clinical trials, there's oftentimes a working hypothesis that if people have an experience of oneness, that's what's going to lead to the reduction in symptoms in depression, anxiety, etc. So oneness is framed as like the gateway, that's the experience that creates the healing. And if we look at those some of those trials and the questionnaires they use, one of them is the Mystical Experience Questionnaire, the MEQ. And if you look at at the language around oneness in that, it really seems to be implying oneness as sameness, right? So there's language around merging, dissolution of boundaries between self and other, etc., things that seem to kind of indicate the sense of sameness. So this pervasive narrative that psychedelics reveal that we are all one, that seems to often mean we're all the same, that's held as the key to healing, but it's potentially harmful for the queer and trans communities. And indeed, we could say any discourse that privileges a singular narrative, it runs the risk of being oppressive, because inherently it's delegitimizing other narratives, other experiences. So when we hold the trope of oneness as the ultimate psychedelic experience, that doesn't leave very much room for other experiences of psychedelics that may be equally meaningful and healing. So we really believe that equity in psychedelics requires taking seriously the multiplicity of experiences that people have. And if it doesn't, then psychedelic spaces, be they clinical or community-based or personal, they risk becoming re-traumatizing rather than places of healing or transcendence. And indeed, part of the trauma for queer and trans people is that their sexual and gender identities are often not taken seriously, not believed, dismissed as unreal, or erased. So for example, queer people being told their sexual orientation is just a phase, trans people's gender identities being seen as somehow fraudulent. And the last thing this community needs is to have its experiences of psychedelics not taken into account, seen as lesser than, delegitimized, silenced, or even expunged from official records if they don't fit that oneness narrative. And we're particularly concerned about this now because we're seeing growing accounts. These are anecdotal, but they're amount to something that seems to be significant. These growing accounts of queer and trans people's psychedelic experiences that suggest that this revelation of we are all one, it may not be the dominant or the most salient, most important, most kind of transformative experience that queer and trans people are having. So there's a question here that maybe we sort of are posing as an open question that we're curious about, would like to know more about, is what kinds of experiences are queer and trans people having? Is there a kind of commonality? And is oneness really that central to it? We have anecdotal answers to those questions, but it'd be great to have a kind of more research on that. As I pause, I'm going to turn it over to Marca, who's going to share their experience that kind of speaks to that very question. But I do want to acknowledge something before we pass the proverbial baton here, is that I'm speaking in very Western academic theoretical language, right? And that's the language of the colonizer, right? And I am descendant, I am part of that colonization. And I'm locating myself there and in that framework, because in that framework, it's important to say, right, oftentimes it's the theory and then storytelling and narrative is seen as the example and somehow lesser than. So there's this hierarchical relationship between the theory, and then it's just the example. That is absolutely not the spirit in which we're bringing our voices together, even though I am more of a theoretician and Marca is more of a storyteller.
Lived experiencer.
Lived experiencer. Oh, I love that. Nice. Yeah. But right, I've learned so much from being in conversation with Marca. Also, the ideas that I put forth are so just infused with it. It would be hard to say kind of where that influence begins and ends. And so these different backgrounds, the different modes of speaking, we're really holding them as two different but equally valuable modes of knowledge production. And Marca, I think as you alluded to just as you were speaking before, was that for Marca, I think sharing their narrative, we've seen that is oftentimes been very empowering for others. So it's important to share it in that context. And also, we really believe that part of the work of decolonization means that we need to make more space to really hear, really listen to, and really learn from voices like Marca's. So Marca, thank you.
Well, thank you. And, I feel that Kate and others, academics such as Kate, and, it's this intersection, that's important that we be able to speak that language too, so we can get resources, get resourced, and maybe decolonize and change from within, so, yeah. And as Kate said, I speak my story only because I believe lived experience in my experience, as well as what I'm hearing from people when I share my experience, is helpful. It's community based. It's not about, I don't try to be too egotistical about it, although I do try to be entertaining at times. But I want people to know, my identity markers. I learned these words. My identity markers that other people might relate with. I don't want any. I hope not to lean into any tokenism here or to like speak for people, any one group of people. But this is my lived experience, and I'm hopeful that people who can relate that it's helpful, and also that this is new. That we get into more nuanced conversation with clinicians who may not consciously, all that harm talk we were talking about potentially there from, that this could be not. We just want to call this into consciousness so that we're having broader conversations and empowering clinicians, empowering community members and the collective. So, and I've written some stuff here so that, because I'll talk all day and all night. So, because I am a storyteller, but I'm going to stick to the script today so we can get to your Q&A. So, so starting with erasure, my experiences of erasure or conformity or impact on identity. I'll speak first with, in my informative years in struggle and wounding, being born into the Bible Belt in Oklahoma, in a region, in a tribal nation heavily impacted by colonization and Christianity, as well as being like an oil town, cattle country, great amount of patriarchy and toxic masculinity. And in school, there was total erasure of Native history, except for at Thanksgiving, but that's not really history. And glorification of things like the land run of Oklahoma, which was like, decimation of natives, and here come the white settlers, and let's have a party and talk about it in history class in high school, with no context other than that. And now this is in the 70s and 80s for me in Oklahoma, in this place called Indian Country, in a town called Ponca, named for the Ponca tribe. No Native history there at the time. Way better now, yay. But I digress. Erasure in this area for me is being mixed race, and I have white privilege, and I'm very clear about this and try to do the best I can in my awareness of that. However, I am Native, and I was born on land that for thousands of years, or possibly since the in our worldview, the beginning of humans, Osages have lived. And that is powerful, and to grow up in that. And but assimilation genocide, meaning the U.S. government's plan that once people have skin tone like I do, they're no longer Native, and they shut up and go away, and we erase, we get rid of the kill the Indian, save the man kind of thing. This was a form of erasure that I had to navigate as in my surroundings as a child as well as now. And this erasure impacts Native communities tremendously in many nuanced ways, too many to talk about today. And then so as a Native person, also as for many queer Native people, gender and sexual orientation are often erased in Native communities impacted by Christianity and colonization. So upon first contact with Europeans, over 100 tribes had gender nonconforming people living within Native societies. And once Christianity was forced upon Native people, that most of that was erased or went underground in Native cultures. And so now we have two-spirit societies, or a two-spirit identity, two-spirit being a term coined in the 90s by Canadian queer Native scholars and leaders. And two-spirit meaning people who are Native American and not from like Ancestry.com, 23andMe kind of Native American, but like more intimate in the lived experience of being Native and LGBTQ, queer. So Native and queer. So if you're not Native, you're not two-spirit. So Q&A or spread the word, okay? That's often confused, and it's appropriation if two-spirit is used for non-Native folks. So erasure for me also landed with gender. I was labeled a tomboy in the 70s, growing up on the rural reservation. I was very happy for that. It worked for me. In most of daily life, I was expressing as genderqueer in dress and, in gender expression, rolling around the dirt, motorcycle, all that, great fun. And it was acceptable because that label of tomboy. Except for things like weddings or piano recitals were the worst, where I basically had to dress in drag in a frilly dress and conform for that. And, you know, I'm saying this in a lighthearted way now, because that's part of how I work with trauma is humor. But it wasn't just something that I didn't like, coming out of tomboy and into that, you know, forced gender expression of the frilly dress. It had serious impact in my life. And then there was erasure of my sexual orientation, which in college in the 80s, I came out as lesbian, and with my gender expression, a butch lesbian. And this did not go as well as being tomboy. It was shocking how it didn't go well. Especially in the height of the AIDS crisis, being queer was, you know, that's when queer was a very negative word. Now we have queer theory in spaces like, you know, where Kate hangs out, you know, it's like, take back that word queer, right?
Claiming.
So I had major attachment disruption with my family, who were not set up by society or where they were living or, you know, their communities around them to support my identity. I witnessed two young girls come out in my high school and be actually just physically abused by other students, the faculty, and members of my hometown. You know, it was so. Eventually, I dropped out of college as a music major because being queer and an artist really, really not okay. And I had, you know, lots of adults and institutions around me telling me I was defective, and part of me believed them. And I became self-destructive on many levels. I nearly died from drugs and alcohol. But also part of that self-destructiveness was, which is common for queer folks, as I'm working in queer, transcending trauma and queer folks, is overcompensating. I was overcompensating, and I became an emergency room nurse eventually, and an ER nurse in the beginning of the AIDS crisis. Most healthcare providers didn't understand and were terrified of HIV transmission on the job in that time. We didn't have an understanding, but being a nurse was like something I could hide behind. I did a lot of great work I'm proud of as a nurse, but it was also like, you know, don't look at any part of my identity except being a nurse, right? Inside, I hated myself, my queerness. But on the outside, I was trying to get, you know, I did get self-esteem for being a rescuer. Overcompensation for being queer, not a good reason to become an ER nurse. Very big trauma. And then sometimes it didn't even help. I got fired from jobs in the 90s in Oklahoma, no doubt, for being gay, you know, not officially, but. And I was an emergency room nurse by day who got gay bashed by a pack of frat boys hanging out in a parking lot outside of a gay bar in Oklahoma City at night. And so, you know, navigating that, I'm helping save those very lives. Like if those guys came in the ER, I would help save their lives, but then they're bashing me in a parking lot, you know, like the hero rescuer didn't help me, ultimately, as a nurse, I ended up at the Oklahoma City bombing as a first responder. You know, basically brutality, what I witnessed there. Also, I'm very proud of that work, but also, you know, this was part of the overcompensation for being queer, that I would put myself into a burning building and try to save people's children, you know. And also that bombing being a white supremacist, you know, militia person who I think was impacted heavily by tour of duty in Iraq with PTSD, but I digress. Passionate about working with veterans for this reason. Basically, I came away from all of this with a hearty case of cumulative PTSD. So by the age of 30, I was having a nervous breakdown, which turned out to be a breakthrough because I left Oklahoma and I landed in the consciousness communities of Boulder, Colorado. It was like hippies and meditation and wheatgrass and Naropa University folks. If there are any out here today, hi, love Naropa University folks bringing healers and artists from all over the world. And I quit being a nurse and I started folk singing in this community. And that was much better, but I was mostly in a kind of white, hetero, cisgendered consciousness space. And people were always curious why I was so angry and edgy and pounding on my guitar. And, you know, I was actually now as a clinician, I know I was anxious, I was hypervigilant, I was avoidant, I had intrusive negative thoughts of myself and not, you know, a lack of safety within community. And I was really working out stuff by writing and performing songs in the coffee shops and bars. And some of them were just heartbreak relationship songs like Melissa Etheridge, you know, but some were folk songs like trying to be like Ani DeFranco. But, you know, one song was about the Oklahoma City bombing, and sometimes I'd sing it and people wouldn't clap. They would just kind of sit there stunned, and then I would make jokes and move on, right? But, you know, but I was suffering in this community, and it was apparent. So a lot of folks there who'd done a lot of self-work, you know, they wanted to help me. They wanted me to just relax or go to yoga class or get in a cuddle pile. And that was, you know, that was all okay, but I didn't really feel safe doing any of those things, and carrying so much trauma. And that's when some of my dearest friends there started suggesting that I try psychedelics. So I did, and my first experience really I was brought into a small Brazilian community there with the daime, Banda daime, or what, you know, folks know as ayahuasca, and I had no idea. I just had friends say, you know, put on white clothes and come with us, and we'll help you. And it was helpful, incredibly helpful. I have to say those, you know, when it comes to, however, oneness, you know, when we get into like the healing for me from all that I just shared, it's like those early experiences, and now also after 20 years of many experiences with plant spirit medicines, ceremonially, personal use, many different forms, the transcendence of trauma, and I don't say the healing of trauma because I just feel like that language fits better, because I don't need to necessarily heal it, because society is what, you know, has caused this, like cultural oppression. So I don't want to put the burden on me or other people with trauma. You know, we're transcending all of this. I just like that word better. And for me, it's been about embracing difference and not a lot about what feels like oneness. The first experiences were very somatic, tremendous amounts of anxious energy coming off my body through purging and shaking, and my bones and nervous system really just being, you know, re-knit by spiritual entities, and lots of different, you know, experiences with somatically. And I started feeling comfortable in my body, and more comfortable in my expression and in my gender expression and my queerness, and some even in my nativeness then. But mostly more around just being in the body and coming forth, generally expressing, and, you know, doing yoga and getting in the cuddle pile and feeling safer, you know. You know, ayahuasca then and even now, you know, also it was really powerful that ayahuasca would tell me it was bad. It has been bad. It has been, you've been hurt by all of this. This is real. Don't deny it. Denying it doesn't help. Don't conform, and don't hide this, mostly from yourself, but also from people who can help, right? Because, yeah, I could talk a lot about that, but that's been an ongoing, powerful experience, because I wanted to erase my own history internally, and that caused even more anxiety and a lack of ability to access care. And ayahuasca, you know, has said, you know, that's been a very powerful relationship I've had there. And then I'll just give one, I know we're at time, so I'll give one powerful example of how about 5 years into this healing path, I had an experience of transcendence and coming forth in my difference in all three areas of erasure. So I was with an elder Ecuadorian medicine person from a long lineage, working with traditional indigenous ayahuasca ceremony. And we were fortunate that he and his family came from Ecuador to be with our community. And so he called me over in the ceremony in the middle of the night, and was moving with limpieza, or spiritual cleansing. And it was intense and powerful, and it lasted for some time. And then he called an interpreter over, and he said he wanted me to know that he'd done some healing on the DNA of my tribal people, and that he wanted me to go back with them and be myself, my true self, and this would be good for me and good for them. And I had not told him any of my story, so this might be an example of like boundaries disappearing, and oneness, and oneness, you know, being the experience of here where he could see. And, you know, this is why I'm not anti oneness, but his message and the healing was, to be myself in my difference. You know, and I kind of laughed when he said this, because I was like, man, you don't know what you're asking me to do, and I don't know how to do that. But I just stayed in, because I was in great healing communities at that point, and I could integrate this. I think integration being so key here for people, that even these experiences, powerful experiences in ceremony, it's like, for me, it's the days after of staying quiet and, you know, integrating and journaling and having integration experience with other people to help me. And from there, life changed. Again, it's a long story, but I will say within a few years, I was a counselor, identified as a counselor at Native American Health Center of San Francisco. I started working with some Osage clients there. That was a big deal for me to be out as Osage and as a counselor and helping families, Osage families. These were cisgender heterosexual people with children, you know, and helping them overcome trauma. And it was a big deal to them that I was Osage. Built trust. Then this led me to become friends with some of the Osage Congress people and our chief. My grandfather had been an Osage Congress person, and I'd always kind of been in, you know, in his shadow. But I actually came forth and started talking to our Congress people and our chief at these gatherings as a counselor, as a trauma therapist. And then I'm a singer too, and I would sing at those events. And so eventually some of our Congress people asked me to sing at the inauguration of our chief, at all, you know, back home in Oklahoma. And I went back home, and my mom, who I've had a lot of healing with, was like, how do you know all these people? Like, what, you're singing at the inauguration? Like, you know, after seeing her child suffer greatly and be, you know, like away from home and struggling, you know, suddenly I'm home and I'm singing at the inauguration, you know, and with short hair and in a traditional men's ribbon shirt and all that. Not everybody was probably happy I sang there, but enough were, which leads to, I took part in the debate on social media and spoke directly to LGBTQ Osages being impacted by hate speech that came out as our tribal nation. Our government was debating same-sex marriage in our nation. They put it to a vote to the people, and as they were debating this, it became just vitriol, hate speech coming out, because we have so much Christianity and colonization, and you know, and of course in the election, same-sex marriage passed, and I'm not saying that's because I confronted Congress people, but the fact that I was able to come forth at gatherings and confront these people on leaving the Bible outside the door and standing for me as a citizen and others like me as a citizen of the Osage Nation, that was powerful. As an activist and as an Osage, you know, activist, but also for me internally to know that I could do this and I'm safe, and it's, you know, you know, that's all. You know, mostly I've embraced difference, you know, and now that's how I work with people and with clients, through this lived experience. And I hope if anybody can relate, you know, that it's powerful for them as it's been powerful for me.
Thank you, Marca, so much for sharing that. I'm mindful of time, just a couple of really quick words, I promise, and then just to wrap it up, and then we'll turn it over to questions from the audience. So I think, Marca, as you were, just a sort of extremely brief, reductive summary, but right, so you're talking about the healing experience of coming into difference and honoring that politics, we've missed the oneness boat, or if people are confronting that, right, and hearing that themselves, here's kind of a counter argument, is that even if that is true, leaving aside the question of whether or not it is, let's just take the hypothesis that, you know, if it's true that we are all one, and that's a very healing, powerful psychedelic experience, one way of understanding that is that it shows us that there's no ontological, no fundamental difference between us, right? That fundamentally we're the same, meaning that gender, sexual orientation, race, etc., are all social constructions. From a queer feminist theoretical perspective, that is true, right? There's an agreement there. But the key thing is social construction. People often come away with that and be like, oh, it's socially constructed. It's not true. It's a fiction. I can just
Why talk about
let
it?
go of it. We should just, if we talk about it, we're reinforcing it. The key piece here is it's social construction. So there's a whole apparatus of, legal institutions, medical discourse, cultural norms, all the things that Marca was describing as being impacted by. Those are, rooted, socially rooted, and a shift in consciousness, unfortunately, is not going to undo those. So we can know that we are all one and still have to do the work of dismantling those systems. And insofar as psychedelics might bring us into that awareness of oneness and social construction, from our vantage point, it actually can call us into the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, rather than away from it. So just leave it at that. I would love to hear, any questions that people have, or just comments, experiences people want to share. Thank you so much for being here again.
Wow, this is just tremendous. There's been a lot of very active chat, a ton of questions. We're not going to be able to do all of it, but we'll try to do some of it. Thank you so much, Marca and Katherine, for this very thoughtful presentation. And as a clinician who specializes in working in work with queer and trans folks, I really appreciate your leadership and pushing us to think more subtly and I think more deeply about these issues, especially our discourses between them, so that we're not just erasing, eliding, or flattening what might be a spiritual truth versus like a social constructed truth to erase people's real systemic violence and systemic discrimination that I think queer and trans folks are subjected to across many cultures. So this is really terrific. I'm going to read some of the questions as they are. I may not have put it quite this way, but I just want to say I'm going to read them as they are. The first one that I'm going to pick out is, what would you say to non-binary folks who engage in traditional ceremonies that lean into binary roles? So for example, quote, men work the fire. Is it possible for a queer person to still feel honored? Like what might you say?
Yeah, we have, a deep need for decolonizing these situations. I'll just speak for myself, and I have had the privilege of having transcendence and support and healing, and so early on in my psychedelic experiences, I would not have been able to have the conversations I've had in binary spaces like that. But I had an experience in a Santo Daime church more recently in life. Wonderful group of people, and when I joined them, I said, I came out as non-binary, and they were like, oh, we're so happy you're here, and do you want to be on the men's side? And I'm like, no. And they're like, do you want to be on the women's side? I'm like, no. And I was like, I want to be in the middle, and I knew that was going to be a conversation. So, ultimately, I chose to be on the women's side, and I wore pants, and I had to, they had to make a call to Brazil, and then they got back and they said, can you wrap, something around that would be kind of like a skirt, and I said, well, yes, but we had long conversations, and that community sat with me, and they, but again, not all non-binary people are going to be comfortable having this conversation. So we have, I know lots of people who don't take part because of this. They don't receive that healing, or in lots of spaces like that. We have skirt shaming also, going on, and from traditional long-standing lineages, medicine folks who are just absolutely will not break out of the binary. And it's traumatic, it's hard. And what can I say is my heart goes out to you, and we have got to find each other. We have to empower each other. We have Two-Spirit Powwow that started, the good people in San Francisco, Two-Spirit group, their Bates, started the Two-Spirit Powwow 12 years ago or something. I was lucky to go to the first one. And, the first one, it was vulnerable going into space. I remember somebody in my family going, why do you need two spirits to have a powwow? Why can't any? And I was like, no, it's like the Stanford powwow, but it's hosted by two spirits. It's not just an exclusive space, although there are exclusive two-spirit spaces because of this very reason. So, this is challenging, and we have to find each other and hold each other in it. Non-binary folks, two-spirit folks, yeah.
I'll follow on with developing this question because these strong gender sorting, binary sorting, men on one side of the room, women on the other side of the room, or men carry the fire, or there's some sort of like a essentialist stereotype around gender seems to be reprised in lots of different settings. There's the issue of some daime practices, but we see this in North American, Western academic practice as well, through this sort of instantiation of the male-female dyad in some psychedelic psychotherapy sessions. So I'll read the next question. How do genderqueer, non/non-binary, two-spirit clinicians navigate the standard? I don't know that it's a standard, but a standard one male, one female setup that's been used so far in psychedelic therapy trials.
Yeah, and that's changed. MAPS has changed that. MAPS, I think, a lot of the researchers were, I think Kate has spoke about that in the article, but that is no longer true. Through the good work of people, I think, internally at MAPS and others who've confronted this, there's, a lot going on within these communities of BIPOC and queer people coming more, and calling it out and calling it in, and that changed. So, which is good. So really, again, it's like those of us who are more privileged and in a safer situation and are supported, confronting. And it's vulnerable to confront. I sweat every time, but I try to lean in and use my privilege in this way. And I could not have done this when I was younger and coming out. I also have enough history of being 54 years old to understand context of history of this. There's been a big evolution around gender expression. It's really decolonizing because, again, we had gender nonconforming people upon first contact from Europeans, that were expressed that, Europeans said derogatory things and that about history, but they were existing in history. So then we had colonization. So this is decolonization that's happening here. But it's, it's coming together in collective and confront those of us who have more privilege, confronting, but in a way that also puts it in context. And I utilize a lot of nonviolent communication training to make connection with people I might disagree with, to make connection with them, to come forth as a human person that they, and also but confrontative, authentic with empathy to kind of, help to change this. And you may have more to say about that, on an academic level or beyond.
Just one other piece is that it just for those, especially if there's anybody, who's attending today who doesn't have that level of, support, or is at a place in their journey where confronting doesn't feel possible or is not an additional burden that they want to take on, and you certainly shouldn't have to. There are, whether they're, clinicians, therapists, coaches, community members, there are lots of, and a growing number of queer, non-binary, trans, two-spirit people who work in psychedelic spaces. So you can find, and actual spaces for ceremonies. So it may take, but I mean, this talk and people attending is a great example of that, right? Like that community is there. So I would encourage people who don't want to confront, find support, find your community. It's there and it's growing.
That's really helpful. I think that you've said things like this elsewhere, but yeah, the burden of centering it on the gender, the queer, non-binary, trans clinician, whose responsibility is it really? And it's all of our responsibilities to get this right, and to decolonize and work out some of these gender stereotypes from our practices. And I will say, though, it's a bit of a myth. And you've pointed this out, but it is a bit of a myth that this is a standard practice. This is a practice, a male-female dyad in psychedelic psychotherapy trials. But as early as at least 15 years ago, in our studies at NYU, under guidance from Jeff Guss and others, we've been using same-sex, different sex, other sex, gender, diverse gendered work. And we have a long way to go, but the male-female dyad is not the totemic practice and has not been in the reemergence of psychedelic clinical trials, and it's certainly not the future because of, I think, a lot of work that good people have done.
Thanks for pointing that out, Alex. I would just, add to that, the fact that there, and I think whoever asked the question is far from alone in thinking that is a standard practice. I mean, the very fact that belief persists, even though it's maybe not factual, it shows kind of, how just cis heteronormative frameworks, how much they attach and how sticky they are and how hard it is to get away from them. And so the sort of like added work we need to do to show that there are, and make visible and make accessible, legible, right, these other frameworks that are happening. And especially important, there's been a few people, everybody's been talking about integration, right? That's a big part of it, because if we don't have these queer, trans, non-binary frameworks, right, to work in, then we run the risk of these other experiences being resumed back into cis heteronormative colonial frameworks. And so, yeah, just another plug for really kind of being mindful of rethinking that and speaking of making legible.
I'm going to read two questions kind of together because they seem related. One is about what skills and trainings can cisgender heterosexual folks who are aspiring psychedelic facilitators pursue to better support and prevent harming members of the queer and trans communities who are seeking healing? So like, what can cis and het folks do? And the second question is, do you have any advice or resources for people who facilitate psychedelic experiences primarily within the queer and trans communities?
I think the first part of the question of what cis hetero people working in this space can do, I mean, the first thing is you obviously are if you're asking this question, I think, is right, being at this talk, these kinds of talks, listening. There are more and more voices speaking out, queer, trans, two-spirit voices speaking out. So seek them out, listen to them, and then read. And I would say read beyond the confines of what just psychedelic literature is. Go and pick up a book on queer theory, Bell Hooks's book on feminism, if feminism is for everybody. I love that book. And just sort of, read interdisciplinarily and just keep, and just, what's the word I'm looking for?
Engage in conversation.
Yeah.
Yes. And also engage in conversations within your communities and ask questions. And, my goodness, Chacruna has so many articles, around this as well. So, it brought in so many great people. Great place to start reading is at Chacruna, I believe.
Yeah. And I would say just on other pieces, speak up and dare to get it wrong.
Yes.
That's okay. If you are a cis heteronormative white privileged person, it may feel uncomfortable to start broaching these topics that you're not well versed in. That's okay. Just and acknowledge that. I may get it wrong, but I'm trying to, do the right thing here and empower these communities. So it's better to speak and not get it perfectly right than to stay silent, in my opinion.
As far as working with clients, that's, again, there's literature but we're just starting. I believe, my understanding is that this research study at OHSU that I'm part of is, there's not much research out there for gender diverse folks and trauma in the psychedelic research world or the non-psychedelic research world. So we have a long way to go, but it's just like, empowering as many folks around you and checking in, just seeking and finding other clinicians who are doing this and asking questions, and don't be shy.
This has been really incredible. We have over 100 people, I think, eagerly listening and learning. I'd like to thank our two speakers, Marca Cassity and Dr. Katherine Costello, for being here with us. In the last minute that we have, is there anything that you would like to share or any parting wishes to the people gathered here today?
Yeah, I just want to say it's always really vulnerable for me to share story, and so, but I just want to let folks know who also want to come forth and share. It's like if you're able to get supporters around you, and just we want you to be safe with it. We don't want this to be traumatizing, to tell your story, but it's just so powerful. So just blessings to all of you who might also want to share your experiences, and also, this is in response to, like, every time I see like something on social justice and on the MAPS social media pages or other social media pages around it, it's so painful to see some of the responses of, why do we need to talk about social justice? You know, if anything, psychedelics teaches we're all one, you know, just like, oh, it's so painful. So if people could just, you know, make note of that and confront that in your communities and, you know, just talk more, confront, get more support, you know, so you can read the articles and learn how to confront that stuff, you know, and ask more questions. Sometimes that's blatant, sometimes it's more subtle also. So yeah, it's tough. It's tough, you know.
And I think I'll just add
Takes bravery.
I think we're just over time, but we're talking so much about building community. Marca is easy to find on the internet. If you Google Marca Cassity, you will find them and you will find a way to contact them. I'm harder to find on the internet. I'm working on that, but I plugged in my email and I also plugged in my email address if anybody does want to get in touch, because it's going to take all of us continuing these conversations, bring it forth to make the kinds of systemic changes that we're talking about.
Yes, and thank you, Shakruna, for all the work.
Yes, and Alex too. People listening may not know, but Alex has done so much work in this space too, and a real inspiration for both of us. So
it's just my honor to moderate and to ask these questions. Thank you, everybody in the audience, for your time. Thank you to our speakers for this very thought-provoking, excellent piece of work. And we will the discourse continues. We will see you all in this track at some point in the future. I don't know exactly how long from now. And take care, everybody.
Webinar. Thank you.
Merci.